Most people think the Titanic story ends when the ship disappears beneath the waves at 2:20 in the morning on April 15th, 1912. But here's the thing nobody talks about. For the 700 survivors floating in those tiny lifeboats, watching 1,500 people die in the freezing Atlantic, their nightmare was just beginning. What followed was years of legal battles, public humiliation, shattered careers, and a cover-up that protected the powerful while crushing the ordinary people who'd already lost everything. This is what really happened after Titanic sank. Quick thing, if these help you sleep, hit subscribe and drop where you're listening from in the comments. Always curious who's out there. Alright, so tonight we're going back to 1912, but before we go anywhere, get comfortable. I mean actually comfortable. Fix your pillows, pull that blanket up, because where we're going, you're going to want to be settled in. So picture this. It's somewhere around 4 in the morning on April 15th. You're crammed into a wooden lifeboat with maybe 30 other people. Some of them are crying. Some of them have stopped making any sound at all. The Atlantic Ocean is black as ink around you, and the air is so cold that your breath hangs in front of your face like little ghosts. An hour ago, you watched the largest ship in the world break in half and slide into the ocean. You heard the screams of 1,500 people hitting water that was 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 Celsius. That's colder than your refrigerator. That's cold enough to kill a person in about 15 minutes. And now it's quiet. Too quiet. The screaming stopped maybe 20 minutes ago, and somehow that silence is worse. You keep staring at the spot where the ship used to be, half expecting to see lights, to see anything, but there's nothing, just black water stretching to the horizon in every direction. Your toes are numb. Your fingers stopped hurting about an hour ago, which isn't actually a good sign. Someone near the back of the boat is shaking so badly that the whole thing rocks, and all you can do is wait. Wait for dawn. Wait for rescue. Wait to find out if anyone you love is still alive. Now, among the 700 and something survivors scattered across those lifeboats and overturned collapsibles, there was a man named Bruce Ismay, and Bruce Ismay was about to become the most hated person in America. See, Bruce wasn't just any passenger. He was the chairman of the White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, the company that had built the supposedly unsinkable ship and packed it full of people and sent it charging through an ice field at full speed. And Bruce Ismay had survived. That might not sound like a problem at first. I mean, surviving sounds like a good thing, right? But here's where it gets complicated. Over 1,500 people had died, including hundreds of women, including children. And yet the wealthy chairman who owned the ship had managed to find himself a seat in one of the lifeboats. The newspapers were going to have an absolute field day with that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stay in this moment a little longer. Let's stay with the survivors floating on that dark ocean, watching the sky slowly turn grey as dawn approached. At around 4 o'clock in the morning, someone spotted lights on the horizon. Low lights. Moving lights. A ship. It was the RMS Carpathia, a Cunard liner that had been steaming through the night at dangerous speeds, her captain pushing his engines to their absolute limits to reach the disaster site. Captain Arthur Rostron had gotten the distress call around midnight and had immediately ordered every possible ounce of speed from his ship. He'd posted extra lookouts, he'd prepared blankets and hot drinks, he'd turned his dining saloons into makeshift hospitals. And now, as the Carpathia pulled up to the first lifeboats, the survivors finally allowed themselves to believe they might actually live through this. Getting 700 traumatized people aboard a ship that wasn't designed to hold them took hours. The Carpathia's crew worked with desperate efficiency, hauling survivors up rope ladders and in slings, handing out blankets the moment they reached the deck. And what they found was bad. There were broken bones from people who'd fallen or been thrown as they boarded the lifeboats. There were fractures and bruises from the chaos of the evacuation. There were people who couldn't stop shaking, who couldn't speak, who just stared at nothing with hollow eyes. And then there was the frostbite. Some survivors had been partially submerged in that 28-degree water for hours. Frostbite had crept up their toes, their feet, their ankles. Skin that should have been pink was waxy and white. Fingers that should have bent sat rigid and unmoving. The Carpathia had 3 doctors aboard and they worked without rest, triaging patients in the dining saloons, treating the worst cases first, trying to save what limbs they could. One of the injured was a young man named Harold Bride. He was just 22 years old, and he'd been one of Titanic's wireless operators. Throughout the sinking, Harold and his colleague Jack Phillips had stayed at their station, tapping out distress signals into the night, trying to reach any ship that could help. They'd stayed until the water was literally flooding into the wireless room, until Captain Smith himself had told them to abandon their post. Jack Phillips didn't make it. Harold Bride did, barely. He'd clung to an overturned, collapsible lifeboat for hours, his feet submerged in the freezing water. By the time the Carpathia pulled him aboard, one foot was badly sprained and the other was black with frostbite. And yet, despite his injuries, despite the fact that he could barely stand, Harold Bride insisted on helping the Carpathia's wireless operator send messages from the survivors. For 3 days, as the ship steamed toward New York, Harold sat at that wireless set, with his bandaged feet dangling beneath him, tapping out message after message after message. Meanwhile, somewhere in the ship's interior, Bruce Ismay had locked himself away. When the Carpathia had picked him up, Ismay had been led to the cabin of the ship's doctor. He hadn't left since. He wasn't eating solid food. He wasn't sleeping. According to one account, he just sat there, staring at the wall, shaking. A 17-year-old survivor named Jack Thayer actually went to visit Ismay, trying to comfort him, which is remarkable when you consider that Jack had just lost his own father in the sinking. He later described finding Ismay staring straight ahead, shaking like a leaf. Even when Jack spoke to him, Ismay didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear him. The chairman of the White Star Line was, to put it simply, a broken man. But the world didn't know that yet. The world didn't know much of anything yet. News of the Titanic disaster was only beginning to filter through the telegraph wires, and it was a confused mess of contradictory reports. Some newspapers said the ship had survived and was being towed to Halifax. Some said all passengers were safe. Some got closer to the truth. In Washington, D.C., a senator from Michigan named William Alden Smith was sitting in his office, staring at the headlines spread across his desk. Smith had a personal connection to this disaster. 6 years earlier, he'd sailed across the Atlantic on a ship called the Baltic, and he'd actually met Captain Edward Smith, same Captain Smith who'd commanded Titanic. Senator Smith had joined the captain for dinner, gotten a tour of the ship, and come away thinking the man was the picture of the reliable old sea captain, steady, experienced, the kind of man who could weather any storm. And now that captain was dead. His ship was at the bottom of the ocean, and Senator Smith wanted to know why. He called the White House. He asked what action President Taft intended to take. The answer, nothing. The president was too consumed with grief over the loss of his close friend, Major Archibald Butt, who'd been aboard the Titanic. Senator Smith hung up the phone and started typing. By the next morning, he drafted a resolution calling for an official Senate inquiry into the disaster. The resolution passed with almost no opposition, and Smith was appointed chairman of the subcommittee that would conduct the investigation. But there was a problem. The survivors were on a ship that was almost to New York. The crew members who could explain what happened were British citizens who could leave American soil the moment they stepped off the Carpathia. If Smith wanted answers, he had to act fast, and that's when things got interesting. See, Smith's office had intercepted some telegrams. Telegrams sent under a clever code name, Yampsy, which, if you flip it around, spells Ismay backwards. Not exactly master-level spycraft, but okay. These telegrams were asking the White Star office to hold a ship called the Cedric so that Ismay and the surviving crew members could board it and return to England immediately, before any investigation, before any testimony, before anyone could ask any awkward questions. Smith was not about to let that happen. On the evening of April 18th, 1912, the Carpathia arrived at the port of New York. The scene at the docks was chaos. Over 30,000 people had gathered. Some were family members desperate for news. Some were reporters hungry for the story of the century. Some were just curious, drawn by the enormity of the disaster. 20 ambulances from Bellevue Hospital were parked near the pier, ready to transport the seriously injured. A ferryboat had been converted into a floating hospital. Volunteers from the Women's Relief Committee waited with food, clothing, and emergency funds. New York had prepared for the worst-case scenario. They'd prepared to receive over 2,000 injured people. Instead, only around 700 walked off that ship. Among those waiting at the dock were Senator Smith and his team. They had subpoenas, they had questions, and they were not going to let anyone leave until they got answers. Smith boarded the Carpathia before most of the survivors had even disembarked. He made his way through the ship until he found the cabin where Ismay had been hiding for 3 days. There was a handwritten sign on the door, "Please do not knock." Smith ignored it. He pushed open the door and found Philip Franklin, the Vice President of International Mercantile Marine, the company that owned White Star Line. Franklin tried to tell Smith that Ismay was too ill to receive visitors. Smith's response was basically, "I'll be the judge of that." 30 minutes later, Smith emerged from that cabin. The reporters who'd been waiting pounced on him immediately. What had happened? What had Ismay said? Smith told them that Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, would be appearing the very next morning at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel for questioning, along with all 4 of Titanic's surviving officers. The investigation was officially beginning. Now, while all of this was happening, while Senator Smith was serving subpoenas and the survivors were staggering off the Carpathia into the arms of their families or into the silence of nobody waiting, there were relief efforts being organised across the city. The Women's Relief Committee had been formed by some of New York's most prominent female figures, and they moved fast. Within days, they had a comprehensive plan for providing services to surviving passengers, especially the immigrants who'd travelled in third class. Because here's the thing about those third-class passengers. Many of them had lost literally everything. They'd been travelling to America to start new lives. They'd packed everything they owned into trunks and suitcases that were now sitting at the bottom of the Atlantic. They'd arrived in a foreign country with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Some of them didn't speak English. Some of them had lost husbands, sons, brothers. What were they supposed to do now? The relief efforts were remarkable. Strangers donated money, clothing, shelter. The Travellers' Aid Society and the Council of Jewish Women stationed themselves at the pier to guide survivors to safe lodging. Hotels offered free rooms, restaurants provided free meals. Back in England, the Lord Mayor of London created the Titanic Relief Fund that spring. It raised over £2 million for survivors and victims' families. In Southampton alone, 549 people had been lost. Nearly all of them were crew members who'd come from working-class families. Suddenly, hundreds of households had lost their breadwinners. Wives had become widows. Children had become fatherless. The Titanic Relief Fund operated for decades. It didn't finally close until 1959, when the children it had helped had grown to adulthood and could finally support themselves. But while strangers were opening their hearts and their wallets, the White Star Line was preparing for a fight. Because even though the ship was at the bottom of the ocean, even though 1,500 people were dead, even though families were shattered and survivors were traumatized, there was still a question of money. Lots of money. Survivors wanted compensation for what they'd lost. Families of victims wanted compensation for their loved ones. And the White Star Line wanted to pay as little as possible. The legal battle was about to begin. And that brings us to the next morning, April 19th, 1912. The Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York City. The doors opened at 9 a.m. and within 3 minutes the East Room was packed to the walls with reporters, photographers and spectators. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Everyone wanted to hear the truth about what had happened aboard the Titanic. An hour later, Senator William Alden Smith arrived. The first witness called to testify was Bruce Ismay, the man who'd hidden in the ship's doctor cabin for 3 days, the man who'd tried to flee the country before anyone could question him, the man who'd survived while 1,500 people had died. Now he was going to have to answer for it. And the cameras started flashing. The cameras were going wild, flashbulbs popping like little explosions across the room, reporters shouting over each other, and there, at the centre of it all, sat Bruce Ismay. He looked terrible. I mean, the man had barely eaten in 4 days. He'd been hiding in a cabin, staring at walls, shaking uncontrollably, and now he was sitting at a conference table in front of dozens of strangers who already thought he was a murderer. Senator Smith had to shout to get control of the room. Get those photographers out of here. And just like that, the flashbulbs stopped. The crowd went quiet, and the questioning began. Now, here's what you have to understand about Bruce Ismay. The newspapers had already decided he was the villain of this story. Before he'd even opened his mouth to testify, they'd given him nicknames. J. Brute Ismay, the coward of the Titanic. One paper suggested the White Star flag should be changed to a yellow liver. Yellow, like a coward. And the accusations were flying fast. People were saying Ismay had pressured Captain Smith to speed up the ship so they could arrive in New York a day early. They said he'd pushed his way onto a lifeboat while women and children were still waiting on deck. They said he was responsible for the whole disaster because he'd ordered the number of lifeboats reduced during construction. Some of this was true, some of it was exaggerated, and some of it was completely made up. But Ismay was going to have to answer for all of it. Smith started with the easy stuff, preliminary questions about the voyage, about Ismay's role on the ship, about what he'd seen that night. Ismay answered carefully, quietly. He looked like a man who knew his whole life was about to fall apart. And then Smith got to the question everyone wanted answered. What were the circumstances of your departure from the ship? Ismay took a breath. The boat was there. There was a certain number of men in the boat, and the officer called out asking if there were any more women. There was no response. There were no passengers left on the deck, and as the boat was in the act of being lowered away, I got into it. Smith pressed him. There were no passengers on the deck. No, sir. It was a simple answer. maybe too simple, because the truth was there were still over 1,000 people aboard that ship when Ismay climbed into his lifeboat. Most of them died, and here was the chairman of the company, alive and well, claiming he couldn't find any more women. The room buzzed with whispered comments. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks. But Ismay wasn't done defending himself. Over the next few hours, he addressed the accusation that kept coming up, the speed. Had he pressured Captain Smith to go faster? Ismay was ready for this one. He said he'd never consulted with the captain about the movement of the ship. Never. The captain didn't consult him either. They'd only discussed one thing. They'd agreed not to arrive at the New York lightship before 5 in the morning on Wednesday. There was nothing to be gained, he said, by arriving any earlier. Smith asked if it was possible to reach New York at that time without pushing the engines to full capacity. "Oh, yes, sir," Ismay replied. There was nothing to be gained by arriving early. Now, here's where things get interesting, because Ismay might have been bending the truth a little. A passenger had overheard him and Captain Smith talking in the ship's reception room. They'd been discussing the ship's speed. Ismay had apparently noted that they were on track to beat the crossing time of Olympic Titanic's sister ship on her maiden voyage. Was that a gentle nudge to push the engines harder? Maybe, maybe not. The captain always had final say over speed and navigation. That was maritime law, even if the owner of the whole company was standing right next to him making suggestions. But the thing is, Captain Smith wasn't around to defend himself. Captain Smith was dead, and dead men can't testify, which meant Ismay could say pretty much whatever he wanted. By the time the first day of testimony ended, Ismay was exhausted, wrung out. He left the conference room and immediately started complaining to reporters about being detained in America against his will. He questioned whether the whole inquiry was even legal, and honestly, that was a tactical mistake, because now he didn't just look like a coward, he looked like a coward who was trying to weasel out of answering questions. The newspapers had a field day. Meanwhile, the next witness was being prepared, and this one was going to be just as dramatic. His name was Charles Lightoller, second officer of the Titanic, the highest-ranking crew member to survive, and he had quite a story to tell. Lightoller was 38 years old, and he'd already lived about 6 lifetimes worth of adventure before ever setting foot on Titanic. He'd been shipwrecked at 15, he'd nearly died of malaria in West Africa, he'd been a gold prospector in the Yukon, a cowboy in Alberta, a cattle wrangler on a ship crossing the Atlantic. The man had done everything. On the night of the sinking, Lightoller had been in charge of loading the lifeboats on the port side of the ship, and he'd made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. See, Captain Smith had ordered women and children first, but Lightoller interpreted that as women and children only. He wouldn't let any men onto his boats unless they were crew members needed to row, even if there were empty seats, even if there were no women around to fill them. One of the boats he lowered had space for 65 people. It left with maybe 40. Senator Smith wanted to know why. Lightoller's explanation was technical. He said he was worried the davits wouldn't hold the weight if the boats were fully loaded. A 70-foot drop with 65 people could be dangerous, so he planned to lower the boats partially full, then fill them up from the gangway doors on the lower decks. Makes sense, right? Except there was a problem. The gangway doors never opened. The men Lightoller had sent to open them were never seen again. The boats rowed away half empty, and hundreds of people died because there was no room for them. Smith's questioning of Lightoller went on for 2 full days, almost 2,000 questions. Lightoller later said he felt like a legal doormat by the time it was over. But Lightoller was what they call a company man. He played his cards close. He gave answers that were technically true but didn't volunteer anything extra. And when it came to protecting the White Star Line, he was loyal to the end. At one point, he was asked about the ship breaking in two. Multiple survivors had reported seeing the stern rise up into the air and then snap off from the bow. The sound, they said, was like nothing they'd ever heard. The Solicitor General asked Lightoller directly, did the ship break apart? Lightoller didn't hesitate. It is utterly untrue. The ship did not and could not have broken in two. He was completely wrong, by the way. We know now that the ship absolutely did break in two. The wreckage on the ocean floor proves it, but in 1912, Lightoller wasn't about to admit that the greatest ship ever built had snapped like a twig. That would be bad for business. While the officers were being grilled about navigation and lifeboat procedures, another story was unfolding, a story about a ship that could have saved everyone. Her name was the Californian. On the night of the sinking, the Californian had been stopped in the ice not far from Titanic's position. Her wireless operator had gone to bed around 11:30, and that's when things went wrong, because about 10 minutes after the wireless operator turned in for the night, Titanic hit the iceberg. Distress calls started going out, CQD, SOS, but the Californian never heard them. Her wireless was silent, her operator was asleep. What the Californian did see, according to multiple crew members, were rockets, white rockets bursting in the sky maybe 5 miles away. The kind of rockets a ship fires when it's in distress. The officer on watch reported the rockets to his captain, a man named Stanley Lord, and Captain Lord's response was basically to do nothing. He assumed it was some kind of company signal. He went back to sleep. When Captain Lord was called to testify, he denied everything. Senator Smith asked him directly, "We know the Titanic sent up rockets for some considerable time. You do not know of any other steamer which on that night sent up rockets?" Lord said no, he didn't know of any other steamer. "Then doesn't it strike you now that the steamer you saw sending up rockets must have been the Titanic?" Lord's answer was simple, no. Smith was incredulous. The timing matched, the rockets matched, the position was close. What other ship could it possibly have been? But Lord stuck to his story. The ship he'd seen was too small. The rockets didn't look like distress signals. He couldn't have reached the Titanic in time anyway because of all the ice. The inquiry never bought it. Their final report would state that if the Californian had responded to those rockets, she might have saved many, if not all, of the lives that were lost. Captain Stanley Lord's reputation was destroyed. He spent the rest of his life trying to clear his name. He never succeeded. But he wasn't the only one whose life was ruined by the inquiry. There was also Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon and his wife Lucy. The Duff Gordons were wealthy, very wealthy. Sir Cosmo was a Scottish landowner, a fencer, an aristocrat. His wife Lucy was a famous fashion designer who dressed half the nobility in London. On the night of the sinking, they'd escaped in lifeboat number 1, an emergency cutter with space for 40 people. It left the ship with 12 people in a boat that could hold 40, while over 1,000 were left behind to die. And that wasn't even the worst part. After Titanic sank, the people in Lifeboat 1 could hear the screaming, hundreds of voices crying out in the darkness, splashing, dying. Someone suggested rowing back to help. The suggestion was rejected. According to later testimony, Sir Cosmo's main concern was that if they rowed back, the desperate swimmers would swamp their boat. They'd all drown together. Better to stay where they were. And then there was the money. At some point during that long, cold night, Sir Cosmo had promised each of the crew members in the boat £5, about £700 in today's money, each. He claimed it was to help them buy new kits. All their belongings had gone down with the ship, after all. Their pay had stopped the moment Titanic sank. They'd need money to get started again. But rumours spread fast, and by the time the inquiry rolled around, everyone was calling it a bribe, hush money, payment to keep the sailors from rowing back to save survivors. When Sir Cosmo took the stand, he was questioned relentlessly. Did he promise money to the crew? Yes. Did he think it was natural not to go back and save people who were drowning? That was a difficult question to answer. I think it was still natural, he finally said, but I concede that it would have been a very splendid thing if it could have been done, a very splendid thing to save drowning people instead of sitting in a half-empty boat listening to them die. The Duff Gordons were never formally charged with anything, but their reputation in London society was finished. For the rest of their lives they were known as the couple who'd bribed their way out of helping. Day after day, the testimony continued. Witnesses were called, questions were asked. The truth slowly emerged from the confusion and the grief and the finger-pointing. And through it all, Senator Smith pressed on, even when the British newspapers mocked him, even when they called him ignorant, incompetent, a fool who didn't know the difference between a watertight compartment and a passenger cabin. At one point, Smith asked Lightoller about the forward funnel collapsing during the sinking. What was this that fell? The forward funnel? Did it strike the boat? It missed the boat. Then what? Well, it fell on all the people that were alongside of the boat. Smith pushed further. Injure any of them seriously? Lightoller just shrugged. I could not say, sir. Kill anybody? I could not say, sir. The British press had a field day with this exchange. They called Smith Watertight Smith after he asked whether the watertight compartments could be used to shelter passengers. They wrote songs making fun of him. They offered him $50,000 to perform at the London Hippodrome on any subject he liked. But here's the thing they didn't understand. Senator Smith might not have been a sailor. He might have asked some dumb questions, but he was getting answers, real answers. For the first time, the world was learning what had actually happened aboard that ship, and that mattered. By the time the American inquiry wrapped up in late May, they'd collected over 1,100 pages of testimony. They'd interviewed 86 witnesses, and they'd reached some damning conclusions. The practice of speeding through ice fields was dangerous and had to stop. The ship hadn't carried enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. The crew hadn't been properly trained for emergencies. The Californian had failed to respond to distress signals, and Captain Smith, for all his experience, had made a grievous mistake. Senator Smith stood before the Senate and delivered his final report. In the construction of the Titanic, he said, no limit of cost circumscribed their endeavour, and when this vessel took its place at the head of the line, every modern improvement in shipbuilding was supposed to have been realised. He paused. So confident were they that both owner and builder were eager to go upon the trial trip. No sufficient tests were made of boilers or bulkheads or equipment. No life-saving devices were reviewed. Officers and crew were strangers to one another and to the passengers. Neither was familiar with the vessel or its tools. Another pause. No drill or station practice or helpful discipline disturbed the tranquility of that voyage, and when the crisis came, a state of absolute unpreparedness stupefied both passengers and crew, and in their despair the ship went down, carrying as needless a sacrifice of noble women and brave men as ever clustered about the judgment seat in any single moment of passing time. The American inquiry was over. But across the Atlantic, another investigation was just beginning, and this one was going to be very, very different. The British were not happy at all. Here they were, the greatest maritime nation on earth, the country that had ruled the waves for centuries, and some American politician from Michigan was dragging their citizens through the mud, detaining British subjects on foreign soil, asking stupid questions about watertight compartments, making a mockery of British seamanship in front of the whole world. Something had to be done. And so, even before the American inquiry had wrapped up, the British government announced they would be conducting their own investigation, a proper investigation, one led by people who actually knew something about ships. The man chosen to oversee it was John Bingham, Baron Mersey, Lord Mersey, as everyone called him. Mersey was an interesting choice. He was a lawyer, a Queen's Counsel, who tried his hand at politics before settling into a career presiding over various legal bodies. His father had been a wealthy merchant from Liverpool, and early in his career, Mersey had worked on shipping cases. He knew the industry. He understood how it worked, maybe a little too well. See, here's the thing about Lord Mersey. He'd been a guest at dinners hosted by shipbuilding companies. He'd rubbed shoulders with the senior leadership of Harland and Wolff, the company that built the Titanic. He'd even dined with Bruce Ismay himself on multiple occasions. At one dinner for the Chamber of Shipping a few years earlier, Mersey had proposed a toast. He'd said that everyone connected with the shipping industry had to make sure nothing was done by legislation or in other ways that would decrease the carrying power of this great country. Decrease the carrying power. In other words, don't let regulations hurt the shipping business. This was the man appointed to lead an independent tribunal into the Titanic disaster. When the Prime Minister was challenged in the House of Commons about whether Lord Mersey might be influenced by the Board of Trade, he bristled. It's an insult to Lord Mersey to suggest it. Maybe, but people were going to suggest it anyway. The inquiry opened on May 2nd, 1912 in a place called the London Scottish Drill Hall. It was a massive space chosen specifically because they expected huge crowds, and they got them. But there was a problem with the venue. Everything echoed, every word bounced off the walls and came back garbled. Half the spectators couldn't hear what was being said. Even Lord Mersey himself complained that the place was unsatisfactory. They didn't move to a different location until the second to last day of the hearings. By then, they'd been struggling with the acoustics for over a month. The Attorney General, Sir Rufus Isaacs, kicked things off by presenting a list of 26 questions the inquiry wanted to answer. They covered everything: the ship's safety equipment, the wireless capabilities, the design, the accessibility between decks, the evacuation procedures. If they could answer all 26 questions, they'd have a complete picture of what went wrong. At least, that was the idea. The first witnesses called weren't officers or company executives. They were ordinary sailors. Lookout Archie Jewell, who hadn't even been on watch when the ship hit the iceberg. Fireman George Beauchamp, leading stoker Frederick Barrett. Barrett's testimony was gripping. He'd been down in the boiler rooms when everything went wrong. He described the red light on the stoking indicator flashing, warning them to shut the dampers on the furnaces. Before they could even react, the ship shuddered, and then the water came. The Solicitor General asked where the water came from. Barrett didn't miss a beat. Out of the sea, I expect. Even in the middle of a tragedy, the British sense of humour was alive and well. Barrett described the water rushing in 2 feet above the deck plates almost immediately, the watertight doors slamming down, the chaos as men scrambled to escape compartments that were filling faster than anyone had anticipated. The inquiry was obsessed with understanding exactly how the water had entered the ship. Witness after witness was asked to describe where they'd seen flooding, at what time, how fast it was rising. They used an enormous half model of the Titanic, about the size of a small rowboat, to demonstrate the layout and trace the water's path through the hull. Lord Mersey and his assessors even took a field trip. They toured the Olympic Titanic's nearly identical sister ship to get a better sense of the layout. They examined the wireless equipment. They looked at the lifeboat davits. They walked the decks where the evacuation had taken place. In their minds, they were putting themselves right there on the night of the sinking. But when the officers finally arrived to testify, things got interesting. Charles Lightoller had already been through the American inquiry. He knew what to expect, but the British investigation was different, more formal, more technical, and in some ways more dangerous, because Lightoller was a company man, and the company was watching. His testimony stretched across 2 full days at the British inquiry as well. Over and over he was asked about his decisions that night. Why had he loaded the boats with so few people? Why had he refused to let men board even when there were empty seats? Lightoller stuck to his story. He'd been worried about the davits. He'd planned to fill the boats from the gangway doors. He didn't realise how bad things were until it was too late. But then came a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Lord Mersey himself leaned forward. "It appears to me that you would be very unlikely to order the forward gangway door to be opened. You might get the head so deep in the water that she might ship water through that gangway door." Lightoller had to admit it. "Of course, my lord, I did not take that into consideration at the time. There was not time to take all these particulars into mind. At this time, I did not think the ship was going down." There it was, the second officer of the Titanic, the man in charge of half the lifeboats, hadn't realised the ship was sinking until it was almost too late. And he wasn't alone. Almost none of the officers had grasped the severity of the situation. The ship was supposed to be unsinkable. The watertight compartments were supposed to keep her afloat. Nobody had planned for what would happen if the unthinkable actually happened. When Lightoller was asked again about the ship breaking in two, he doubled down on his denial. Multiple survivors had described seeing the stern rise up and snap off. They'd heard the groaning metal. They'd watched the lights flicker and die as the bow pulled away from the rest of the ship. But Lightoller wouldn't budge. "I should not think," he said, "after once she had shown a tendency to break and was weakened, she would ever have the strength to right again." Lord Mersey gave him one more chance. "You do not give credit to those witnesses who say that the after part of the ship, having once been up in the air, righted itself?" "No, my lord, I do not. Lightoller was wrong. We know that now. The wreckage on the ocean floor sits in 2 pieces, bow and stern, about 2,000 feet apart. The ship absolutely broke in 2. But admitting that would have been admitting that the greatest ship ever built had failed catastrophically, and that wasn't something the British shipping industry wanted to hear. Bruce Ismay was called to testify again at the British inquiry, but this time the questioning was noticeably gentler. In America, Senator Smith had grilled him for hours about the speed of the ship, about whether he'd pressured the captain, about why he'd gotten into a lifeboat while so many others died. In Britain, the questions seemed almost designed to help him clear his name. Lord Mersey went out of his way to note that if Ismay had stayed aboard and died, it would only have added one more to the death toll. What good would that have done? It was a fair point, but it was also a kindness that few of the ordinary passengers and crew received. Because here's something that gets overlooked about the British inquiry. They questioned a lot of people. Officers, sailors, firemen, company executives, even a famous polar explorer named Ernest Shackleton, who talked about how to navigate safely through ice. But you know who they didn't question? A single third-class passenger. Not one. Over 500 people from third class had died. They'd been housed in the lowest decks, farthest from the lifeboats. Many of them didn't speak English. Many of them had no idea how to get to the boat deck when the evacuation started. They'd wandered through identical-looking corridors, desperately trying to find their way up while the water rose around them, and the British Inquiry couldn't be bothered to ask even one of them what had happened. Yet somehow, in their final report, they concluded that there was no structural reason that any class of passengers had less opportunity than another to reach the deck and the lifeboats. No structural reason, never mind that third class was housed hundreds of feet away from the boats. Never mind that they were stories below the boat deck. Never mind that the survival rate for third-class passengers was less than half that of first class. Apparently, according to the inquiry, everyone had an equal chance. If you believe that, I've got a ship to sell you, slightly used, some water damage. The inquiry dragged on for 36 days. That's twice as long as the American investigation. Whether that was thoroughness or just bureaucratic long-windedness is a matter of opinion. One of the most dramatic moments came when they questioned the lookouts. Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee had been the men in the crow's nest when the iceberg was spotted. Fleet's testimony was haunting. He described seeing the berg dead ahead, a dark mass against the starry sky. He'd rung the warning bell 3 times and telephoned the bridge immediately. What did you say? Iceberg right ahead. The officer on the bridge had thanked him, and then, for about 37 seconds, nothing happened. The ship kept steaming forward. Fleet watched the iceberg getting closer and closer. Then, finally, the bow started to swing. The ship was turning, but it was too late. The iceberg scraped along the starboard side with a grinding shudder that woke passengers from their beds. Fleet was asked if binoculars would have helped him spot the berg sooner. Certainly, he said. So why didn't the lookouts have binoculars? This was where things got embarrassing for the White Star Line. There had been binoculars aboard. They'd been locked in a cabinet, and nobody could find the key. The key had apparently been with an officer named David Blair, who'd been removed from the crew at the last minute before the ship sailed. He'd taken the key with him by accident. Nobody had thought to get a replacement. So the lookouts on the biggest ship in the world, steaming through an ice field at night, were scanning the horizon with nothing but their bare eyes. Would binoculars have made a difference? Maybe, maybe not. The conditions that night were unusual. No wind, no waves, no moon. The water was so calm that there was no white foam breaking at the base of the icebergs to give them away. But still, the key was in someone's pocket back in Southampton, and 1,500 people were dead. As the weeks went on, the inquiry examined everything: the design of the ship, the strength of the hull, the height of the watertight bulkheads, the protocols for receiving ice warnings, the training of the crew. And slowly, a picture emerged, not of criminal negligence exactly, but of complacency, of an industry so confident in its own technology that it had stopped planning for disaster, of regulations that hadn't kept pace with the size of modern ships, of a culture where speed and schedule mattered more than caution. The Titanic had carried more lifeboats than regulations required, but regulations only required enough boats for about a third of the people aboard. The rules had been written for ships half the size of Titanic, and nobody had bothered to update them. Why not? Because the Board of Trade, the government body responsible for maritime safety, was advised by representatives from the big shipping companies, and those representatives had a financial interest in not cluttering up their beautiful new ships with dozens and dozens of lifeboats. So the rules stayed the same, and the ships got bigger, and everyone assumed that modern technology had made disasters like this impossible, until it wasn't. One of the final witnesses was Alexander Carlyle, who'd been involved in designing Titanic before leaving the company. Lord Mersey asked him directly how many lifeboats he thought the ship should have carried. Carlyle didn't hesitate. 48 boats. 48, 3 times what the ship actually had, enough for everyone aboard, but the company had decided that was too many, too expensive, too cluttered. They'd settled on 20 boats instead. The inquiry was wrapping up. 36 days of testimony, over 25,000 questions asked, and now Lord Mersey had to write his report. What would he conclude? Who would he blame? The survivors and the families of the dead waited anxiously. They wanted justice. They wanted accountability. They wanted someone to admit that this disaster hadn't been an act of God. It had been a failure of human judgment. But this was the British inquiry, and the British shipping industry was watching, and Lord Mersey had once raised a toast to making sure nothing hurt the carrying power of this great country. Throughout the inquiry, one name kept coming up: Captain Edward Smith, the man who'd commanded Titanic, the man who'd received multiple ice warnings that day and kept his ship charging ahead at full speed, the man who'd gone down with his ship, leaving no testimony, no explanation, no defence. Multiple witnesses described seeing Captain Smith in the final moments. Some said he'd been on the bridge, calm and composed as the water rose around him. Some said he'd swum to a lifeboat, handed over a baby, and then swum away again. Some said he'd shot himself. The truth was, nobody really knew what happened to Captain Smith. He'd simply vanished into the chaos. But the inquiry had to decide whether he was to blame, and this was where things got complicated. Because Captain Smith had done exactly what other captains did. He'd maintained speed through an ice field on a clear night, trusting his lookouts to spot any danger in time. It was standard practice. It was what the shipping companies expected. It was what passengers wanted, because it got them to their destinations faster. The only difference was that this time it hadn't worked. Ernest Shackleton, the polar explorer, had been asked about this. Would he slow down if he knew there was ice ahead? "I always did," Shackleton said, even on a ship that could only manage 6 knots at full speed. But ocean liners weren't expedition ships. They had schedules to keep, passengers to please, reputations to maintain, and so they raced through the darkness hoping for the best. The report would be delivered on July 3rd, 1912. And when it came, it would satisfy almost no one. July 3rd, 1912. The final report landed with a thud. Lord Mersey stood before the assembled crowd and delivered his conclusions. 26 questions had been asked. 26 answers had been provided. And now, the world would know who was responsible for the deaths of 1,500 people. Except, well, according to the report, nobody was really responsible. Oh sure, there were findings. The speed of the ship, around 22 knots when approaching the ice field, was excessive. At least 8 lifeboats had been lowered with room for more passengers. The Californian had failed to respond to distress signals, but when it came to assigning actual blame, the report got suddenly conveniently vague. Captain Smith, they concluded, had made a mistake, a very grievous mistake. But it wasn't negligence. He was just doing what other skilled captains would have done in the same situation. He was following standard practice. He wasn't trying to set any records or please anyone in particular. In these circumstances, Lord Mersey wrote, "I am not able to blame Captain Smith." Not able to blame him. The captain who received at least 8 ice warnings that day. The captain who didn't slow down. The captain who didn't post extra lookouts. The captain whose ship hit an iceberg and sank with enormous loss of life. Not to blame. Now compare that to what happened to a Captain Watkins about a decade earlier. Watkins had commanded a ship called the Paris. He'd made a small mathematical error while navigating, and his ship had run aground off the coast of Cornwall. Nobody died. The ship survived, but the inquiry found his error constituted negligence, and his career was over. Captain Smith kills 1,500 people, not his fault. Captain Watkins bumps a rock and everyone lives. Career destroyed. The difference, of course, was the ship. The Paris was old, unremarkable, nobody cared about it. The Titanic was the pride of British shipbuilding, the newest, biggest, most luxurious vessel afloat. If Captain Smith was negligent, then the whole system that trained him and employed him and told him to speed through ice fields was negligent. The shipping companies were negligent, the Board of Trade was negligent, and nobody wanted to admit that. The report did make some recommendations. Ships should carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Watertight bulkheads should be built higher. Crews should practice more emergency drills. Wireless operators should be on duty around the clock. All sensible stuff. All things that should have been obvious before 1,500 people died. But here's the part that really stung. Remember how over 500 third-class passengers died. Remember how they were housed in the lowest decks, farthest from the lifeboats, with no clear path to safety. Remember how not a single one of them was asked to testify at the British inquiry. The final report addressed whether the ship's layout had disadvantaged them, and the conclusion was remarkable. There was, according to Lord Mersey, no structural reason that any class of passenger had less opportunity to reach the lifeboats than any other class. No structural reason the people packed into steerage, sleeping in bunks 6 decks below the boats, had exactly the same chance as the millionaires in their first-class suites on the upper decks. The survival numbers said otherwise. 62% of first-class passengers survived, 41% of second class, 25% of third class, but sure, no structural reason. Charles Lightoller, the loyal company man, would later write about the inquiry in his memoirs. He didn't mince words. A washing of dirty linen would help no one, he wrote. The Board of Trade had passed that ship as in all respects fit for the sea. Now the Board of Trade was holding an inquiry into the loss of that ship. He paused for effect, hence the whitewash brush. The British inquiry was over. The recommendations would eventually lead to real changes in maritime safety. But justice, accountability, the families of the dead got none of that. And speaking of the families, while all these inquiries were happening, another battle was brewing. A quieter one. Fought not in courtrooms packed with spectators, but in legal offices and through stacks of paperwork. The battle for compensation. See, when most people climbed into those lifeboats on the night of April 14th, they weren't thinking about their belongings. They weren't thinking about the jewellery they'd left in their cabins, the furs, the expensive dresses, the family heirlooms passed down through generations. They were thinking about survival. Most of them grabbed nothing. Some didn't even have time to put on proper clothes. They fled the sinking ship in their nightgowns, their pyjamas, their bare feet. And when Titanic went down, everything they owned went with it. Now, you might think that when a shipping company loses your ship and kills your family members, they'd be falling over themselves to make things right. You might think compensation would be automatic, generous, apologetic. You would be wrong. In October of 1912, just 6 months after the disaster, the White Star Line filed a petition in the Southern District of New York. They wanted to limit their liability. Limit it, as in cap the amount of money they'd have to pay. Their argument was based on an old law from 1851. The law said that in cases of unavoidable accidents, a shipping company was only liable for the total value of the passengers' fares, plus any cargo fees, plus any materials salvaged from the wreck. Do the math on that. Passenger fares came to about $85,000. Cargo was worth a couple thousand more, and the only thing salvaged from the Titanic, the lifeboats. Grand total liability under this law, $91,805. For 1,500 deaths. For hundreds of injuries. For millions of dollars in lost property. $91,000. Split among everyone. The White Star Line's lawyers argued that the collision was an inevitable accident. Nobody could have predicted it. Nobody could have prevented it. The company wasn't aware of any negligence by the captain or crew, so they shouldn't be held responsible. It was a bold strategy. Some might call it shameless, but it was legally sound, and White Star was going to fight hard to make it stick. Between October 1912 and January 1913, notices were placed in the New York Times. If you had a claim against the White Star Line, you had until April 15th, 1913 to file it. April 15th, the 1-year anniversary of the sinking. As if the survivors needed another reminder, and file they did. Hundreds of claims poured in from around the world. When the deadline passed, the total came to over $16 million. $16 million. In 1913 money, that's almost $500 million today. An absolutely staggering sum. The claims were divided into 4 categories: loss of life, loss of property, loss of life and property combined, and injuries. That last category, injuries, contained some of the most harrowing accounts of the disaster. There was Anna McGowan from Chicago. She'd been travelling back to America when the ship started sinking. She couldn't get onto a lifeboat in time, so she did the only thing she could do. She jumped. Imagine that for a second, standing on the deck of a sinking ship. The lifeboats are gone. The water is rising, and your only option is to leap into the freezing Atlantic and hope someone fishes you out before you die. Anna jumped. She survived, but she sustained permanent injuries from the fall, from the shock, and from the frostbite that followed. Her claims said she was unable to provide for herself anymore. Then there was Bertha Noon from Rhode Island. Bertha hadn't jumped. She'd been shoved onto a lifeboat during the evacuation, pushed so hard that she was injured in the process, and then she'd sat in that tiny boat for hours, exposed to the freezing cold, waiting for rescue. Her list of injuries was extensive. An injured back and spine that left her unable to wear corsets, which in 1912 was actually a serious problem. Women's fashion basically required corsets, severe nervous shock, a misplaced womb, recurring congestion in her head and chest that left her unconscious for days at a time. She asked for $25,000. That's over $700,000 in today's money. The property claims revealed just how stark the class differences aboard Titanic had been. Margaret Brown, one of the most famous survivors, filed a claim for over $27,000. She'd lost multiple furs, gowns, capes, dresses, a necklace worth $2,000 by itself. Irene Harris, the widow of Broadway producer Henry Harris, sought $1 million. Her husband had died in the sinking, and she wanted compensation for his lost future earnings on top of everything else. And then there were the Carters. William and Lucille Carter had been travelling with something unusual in the ship's cargo hold, a brand new 1912 Renault automobile, one of the fanciest cars you could buy at the time. They'd been planning to drive it around Europe before the war made that impossible. The Renault went down with the ship. Carter filed a claim with Lloyd's of London seeking $5,000. But for every wealthy passenger claiming tens of thousands in lost jewellery, there were dozens of third-class passengers with much humbler claims. Young Hee, for example, his entire claim totalled just £9, 15 shillings. The most expensive item? A suit valued at £2.50. That's the difference between first class and third class. One passenger loses a $2,000 necklace. Another loses a suit worth maybe $50. Both lost the same thing, really. Everything they had. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. Depositions were taken in 1913 and 1914. Survivors had to relive the disaster over and over, describing in detail what they'd seen, what they'd lost, what had happened to them. Bruce Ismay was deposed again, and again he had to defend himself against the same accusations. Had he pushed Captain Smith to go faster? Had he jumped into a lifeboat while women and children were still waiting? Ismay stuck to his story. All decisions were made by the captain. He was just a passenger. He'd gotten into a boat only after being told there were no more women on deck. The lawyers representing the survivors tried to prove that the White Star Line had been negligent. They argued that the company knew about the ice warnings but kept the ship at full speed anyway. They pointed out that the crew hadn't been properly trained, that the lifeboat drill in Southampton had tested only 2 boats out of 20, that the lookouts didn't have binoculars. All fair points, all true. But proving that the company knew about the negligence and allowed it to happen, that was harder. The hearings weren't held until June of 1915, over 3 years after the disaster. By then, memories had faded, details had gotten fuzzy, the emotional impact of the tragedy had dulled, at least for the lawyers and judges involved. While the hearings dragged on, negotiations were happening behind closed doors. The survivors and their lawyers knew they might not win in court. The 1851 law was heavily stacked in favour of the shipping company. Even if they could prove negligence, they might walk away with nothing. Better to settle for something than risk everything on a trial. In December of 1915, a settlement was reached. White Star would pay $664,000 to be divided among all the claimants. $664,000 out of the $16 million they'd originally asked for. That's about 4% of what the survivors had claimed. 4 cents on the dollar. For some of the wealthy passengers, it was an insult. For the third-class families who'd lost everything, it was barely enough to start over. Judge Julius Mayer signed the final decree in July of 1916. The company was found guiltless of any probability and knowledge, not liable for any loss, damage, injury, or death. 4 years after the disaster, hundreds of claims, thousands of pages of testimony. And in the end, the shipping company walked away having paid a fraction of what they owed. It was one of the great injustices of maritime law. And the worst part, the law that protected White Star had been written to encourage shipbuilding and trade. The whole point was to minimise risk for ship owners, so they'd keep investing in new vessels, keep expanding commerce, keep making money. The law worked exactly as intended. It protected the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. Some of the survivors were furious. They'd lost husbands, wives, children. They'd watched people die. They'd suffered injuries that would affect them for the rest of their lives. And now they were being told that the company responsible owed them almost nothing. Others were just exhausted. The legal battle had dragged on for years. They'd had to relive the disaster over and over in depositions and hearings. They'd had to put a dollar value on their grief, on their trauma, on their dead relatives. How do you even do that? How do you look at a form and write down how much your father was worth, your husband, your child? Some claims tried. The family of Isidor Strauss, the wealthy department store owner who died alongside his wife Ida, filed for enormous sums, but money couldn't bring them back. Money couldn't undo what had happened. The Strauss family had been offered a spot in a lifeboat. Ida had refused to leave her husband behind. They'd been seen sitting together on deck chairs as the ship went down, holding hands. What's that worth? What number do you put on a love story like that? The settlement money was distributed according to a formula: how much you'd lost, how strong your claim was, how good your lawyer had been. Some families got thousands, some got hundreds, some got almost nothing. And White Star Line, they kept operating. They kept running ships across the Atlantic. They merged with Cunard in 1934 and eventually faded into history. But for the survivors, money wasn't really the point. The point was acknowledgement, recognition that something terrible had happened and somebody was responsible. They never got that. The inquiries blamed the ice, the court blamed nobody, and the families of the dead were left to grieve in silence, their losses reduced to numbers on a legal form. Meanwhile, the people who'd actually survived the sinking had to figure out how to live with what they'd experienced. And that, it turned out, was its own kind of nightmare. Here's something most people don't know about working on a ship in 1912. Your wages stopped the moment your ship sank. Not when you got rescued, not when you reached shore. The exact moment the vessel disappeared beneath the waves, you were off the clock. Didn't matter if you were floating in a lifeboat waiting for dawn. Didn't matter if you were clinging to a piece of wreckage in freezing water. As far as the company was concerned, you weren't their employee anymore. So for the 700 or so survivors of the Titanic, the paychecks stopped at 2:20 in the morning on April 15th, right around the time the stern slipped under and the screaming started. Welcome to the wonderful world of Edwardian labour relations. Most of Titanic's crew came from Southampton, working-class families, men who'd signed on because it was decent pay and steady work, firemen who shoveled coal into the boilers, stewards who served meals and made beds, sailors who scrubbed decks and handled ropes. Now they were unemployed. Many had lost all their belongings when the ship went down. Their families back in Southampton were already grieving the 549 locals who died, and the survivors had to somehow pick up the pieces and get back to work. Most of them did exactly that. Within weeks of the disaster, some were already signing on to new ships. A few even joined the crew of Olympic, Titanic's nearly identical sister. Imagine that. Walking those decks every day, passing through corridors that looked exactly like the ones where your shipmates had died. But the crew had one more indignity to suffer first. There was a company called CW and FN Black. They were the agents who contracted musicians to play on ocean liners, the band that had famously kept playing as Titanic sank, trying to keep passengers calm while the ship went down around them, had been employed through this company. Every member of the band died that night. All 8 of them. They'd played until the water was literally washing over the deck, and then they'd gone into the Atlantic along with everyone else who couldn't find a seat in a lifeboat. One of those musicians was a young man named Jock Hume. He was just 21 years old, a violinist, by all accounts a talented one. A few weeks after the sinking, Jock's parents received a letter from CW and FN Black. You might think it was a condolence letter, an expression of sympathy, maybe even an offer of compensation for their son's heroic final hours. Nope. It was a bill. The company was asking for 14 shillings and 7 pence. The cost of Jock's uniform, which had been lost with the ship, 14 shillings. For the uniform their dead son had been wearing when he drowned. Jock's father was furious. Instead of paying, he sent the letter to the Amalgamated Musicians Union, who published it in their newsletter. The story spread, people were outraged, and that pretty much sums up how the system treated ordinary workers in 1912. You could die a hero, playing music while a ship sank beneath your feet, and the company would still send your grieving parents a bill for your clothes. But what about the officers? The men who'd been in charge that night, who'd loaded the lifeboats and given the orders and tried to manage an impossible situation. Their stories are complicated. Let's start with the man we've already talked about, Charles Lightoller. Second officer, the highest-ranking survivor, the company man who denied the ship broke in two and defended White Star's decisions at every turn. After the inquiries wrapped up, Lightoller went back to work. He served as first officer on the Oceanic, another White Star ship. Later, he moved to the Olympic. He was promoted to first officer, which should have been the stepping stone to finally getting his own command, but it never happened. See, the cloud of Titanic hung over all the surviving officers. Nobody wanted to give them a captain's chair. It would remind passengers of the disaster. It would raise questions. Better to keep them in the background, out of sight, doing their jobs quietly. Lightoller eventually left White Star. He took odd jobs for a while. Innkeeper, chicken farmer, property speculator. The man who'd survived one of history's greatest disasters was now raising chickens in the English countryside. But he wasn't done with adventure, not by a long shot. When World War I broke out, Lightoller was called up to active duty with the Royal Navy. He commanded a torpedo boat. He sank a German submarine by ramming it with his ship. He fought a Zeppelin that was trying to bomb England. And then came the moment that would define the second half of his life. It was May of 1940. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, surrounded by German forces waiting to be evacuated or slaughtered. The British government put out a call for civilian boats to help ferry soldiers across the English Channel. Lightoller was 66 years old. He owned a 58-foot motor yacht called the Sundowner. When the Admiralty asked to requisition his boat, he agreed, on one condition: he'd sail it himself. So on June 1st, 1940, Charles Lightoller, his eldest son Roger, and a young sea scout named Gerald Ashcroft set off across the channel toward Dunkirk. The Sundowner had been built to carry maybe 21 people. Lightoller came back with 130. He'd pulled men off the sinking destroyer HMS Worcester. He'd picked up stragglers from other boats. He'd packed soldiers into every inch of space, below decks and above, until his little yacht was riding dangerously low in the water. German planes strafed them on the way back. Lightoller had to zigzag and dodge, calling out course changes to his son at the wheel while bombs fell around them. At one point, a Junkers 88 bomber was lining up for a killing run when a British Spitfire swooped in and shot it down. The German plane crashed into the sea just yards from the Sundowner. Not a single man was lost aboard Lightoller's boat that day. When they finally reached the English port of Ramsgate, a stunned petty officer counted the soldiers pouring off the Sundowner, 130 men, from a boat meant for 21. One of the soldiers supposedly quipped as he came aboard, "Just our luck, the skipper was on the Titanic." Another one answered, but he survived. Lightoller died in December of 1952 at the age of 78. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered at Mortlake Crematorium. He never got to command his own passenger ship, but he'd saved lives at Dunkirk, survived the Titanic, and lived to tell about both. Not bad for a chicken farmer. The other surviving officers had quieter fates. Third Officer Herbert Pittman continued with White Star after the disaster. He served on the Oceanic, then the Olympic, but his eyesight started failing, and eventually he was taken off the bridge and made a purser instead. He left the company in 1922. Like Lightoller, he never commanded his own passenger ship. Fourth Officer Joseph Boxhall, the man who'd fired the distress rockets and tried to signal that mysterious ship on the horizon, stayed with White Star for years. He served on the Adriatic. He was promoted to second officer on the Olympic. When White Star merged with Cunard in 1933, Boxhall transferred to the Aquitania, eventually becoming chief officer. 41 years at sea. He finally retired in 1940, and when he died in 1967, his ashes were scattered at the coordinates he'd calculated for Titanic's sinking position. The position that, it turned out, was about 13 miles off from where the wreck actually lay. Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, the fiery Welshman who'd actually gone back with his lifeboat to pull survivors from the water, served in the Royal Navy during World War I and then returned to White Star. He retired in 1931 and lived quietly in Wales until his death in 1944. None of them ever got their own command. None of them ever captained a passenger liner across the Atlantic. The shadow of Titanic followed them their entire careers. But at least they had careers. At least they could go back to sea. For the passengers who survived, the trauma manifested in different ways. There was a man named Frank Goldsmith. He'd been 9 years old when the Titanic went down. He'd been in one of the last lifeboats to leave, sitting with his mother, watching his father disappear into the crowd still aboard the sinking ship. Frank survived. His father didn't. For the rest of his life, Frank Goldsmith couldn't go to baseball games. It wasn't the sport, it was the crowd. When the home team scored and 30,000 people leapt to their feet and roared, it sounded too much like what he'd heard that night. The screaming of 1,500 people in the water, the desperate cries for help that gradually, horribly went silent. Every time a crowd cheered, Frank was back in that lifeboat, 9 years old, listening to people die. He lived until 1982, 70 years after the disaster, and he never did get comfortable with the sound of cheering crowds. Other survivors dealt with it differently. Some talked about it constantly. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, told their stories to anyone who would listen, processing the trauma by sharing it. Others went completely silent. They never spoke of the Titanic again, not to friends, not to family. The subject was simply off limits, a door that had been closed and locked and bricked over. Bruce Ismay was one of these. After the inquiries ended and the lawsuits were settled, Ismay retreated from public life. He resigned as chairman of White Star Line in June of 1913. He moved part-time to a cottage in Connemara on the west coast of Ireland, where he could fish for trout and salmon and not have to look anyone in the eye. His wife Florence made sure the subject of Titanic was never discussed within the family, ever, for anyone. The disaster that had defined her husband's public image was simply erased from their private world. Ismay's granddaughter later described him as a corpse in his later years, a man who had withdrawn into a silence so complete that he barely seemed alive. He wandered through parks by himself. He attended concerts alone. He engaged strangers in conversation, perhaps because strangers didn't know who he was, didn't know what he'd done, didn't look at him with accusation in their eyes. In 1936, at a family gathering, one of Ismay's grandsons asked him an innocent question. Had he ever been in a shipwreck? It was probably the first time anyone in the family had dared bring it up in decades. Ismay answered quietly, "Yes, I was once in a ship which was believed to be unsinkable." That was all he said. That was all he could bear to say. The following year, Ismay's health deteriorated. He had diabetes. His right leg had to be amputated. He spent most of his time in a wheelchair. On October 14th, 1937, Bruce Ismay collapsed in his bedroom after a massive stroke. He was unconscious, blind, unable to speak. 3 days later, he died. He was 74 years old. His funeral was held at St Paul's Church in Knightsbridge. He was buried in Putney Vale Cemetery in London. The man who had been called the coward of the Titanic, who had been mocked and vilified and blamed for 1,500 deaths, was finally at peace. Whether he deserved that peace is a question people still argue about today. The Titanic Relief Fund, which had been set up to help survivors and victims' families, continued operating for decades. It didn't finally close until 1959. By then, the children who'd been orphaned by the disaster had grown up, the widows had remarried or passed away, a new generation had come of age that knew the Titanic only from history books. But the scars remained, in the families, in the survivors, in the town of Southampton, which had lost so many of its men, and in the laws that governed safety at sea, because the Titanic disaster did change things, not as quickly as it should have, not as thoroughly as the victims deserved, but it changed things. Ships started carrying enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. Wireless operators were required to stay on duty around the clock. The International Ice Patrol was established to monitor icebergs in the North Atlantic shipping lanes. The Radio Act of 1912, the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, rules about watertight bulkheads and emergency drills and distress signals. 1,500 people had died, but their deaths had meaning. Their deaths changed the way the world thought about safety at sea. Cold comfort for the families, but comfort nonetheless. And what about Harold Bride, the young wireless operator who'd kept sending messages even as the ship went down, who'd worked for 3 days straight aboard the Carpathia with frostbitten feet, helping transmit survivor lists to anxious families waiting on shore? He kept a low profile after the disaster, testified at both inquiries, collected $1,000 from the New York Times for his exclusive story, and then quietly disappeared from public view. He served as a wireless operator on other ships during World War I. In 1920, he married a woman named Lucy Downey. They had 3 children together. They moved to Scotland, where Bride became a salesman. He never talked much about the Titanic, never sought the spotlight, never tried to cash in on his fame as one of the disaster's heroes. Harold Bride died in 1956, 44 years after the sinking. He was 66 years old. His ashes were scattered at a crematorium in Glasgow. The man who'd stayed at his post until the water was flooding the wireless room, who'd joked about sending SOS because it might be the last chance to use it, who'd clung to an overturned lifeboat while his colleague Jack Phillips froze to death beside him, never made a fuss about any of it. He just lived his life, quietly, privately, carrying whatever ghosts he carried. Some people process trauma by talking, some by staying silent. Harold Bride chose silence, and somewhere at the bottom of the North Atlantic, the Titanic herself lay waiting, undiscovered, undisturbed, a tomb for those who'd never made it to the lifeboats. She would stay there, silent and forgotten, for 73 years. Until someone finally went looking, the world learned from the Titanic, slowly, painfully, but it learned. In the months after the disaster, governments on both sides of the Atlantic started asking uncomfortable questions. How had the regulations gotten so out of date? How had ships grown to 50,000 tons while the lifeboat rules were still written for vessels half that size? How had an industry so confident in its own technology become so blind to basic safety? The answers were embarrassing. The British Board of Trade, the agency responsible for maritime safety, hadn't updated its lifeboat requirements since 1894. Back then, the biggest ships were around 13,000 tons. The rules said any ship over 10,000 tons needed 16 lifeboats. That was it. Didn't matter if your ship was 15,000 tons or 50,000. 16 boats. When the Titanic was being built, Alexander Carlisle, one of the designers, had argued for 48 lifeboats, enough for everyone, but the company decided that was too many, too expensive, too cluttered. They went with 20 boats instead, which was actually more than the regulations required, and the Board of Trade signed off on it, because the rules said 16 was enough and 20 was better than 16. So what was the problem? The problem was that Titanic could carry over 2,000 people, and 20 boats could save maybe half of them. The math was obvious. Nobody bothered to do it. After the disaster, that changed fast. The Radio Act of 1912 was one of the first reforms. It passed in the United States just 4 months after the sinking. The law required all ships carrying 50 or more passengers to have wireless equipment, and not just any equipment powerful enough to reach other ships at a reasonable distance. More importantly, the law required wireless operators to be on duty around the clock. Remember the Californian, the ship that sat within sight of the Titanic watching rockets go up while its only wireless operator slept? That could never happen again. From now on, someone had to be listening at all times. Distress calls would never go unanswered because the operator had gone to bed. The law also cracked down on amateur radio operators. Before the Titanic disaster, the airwaves were a mess. Hobbyists with homemade equipment would jam up frequencies, making it hard for ships to communicate. The Radio Act assigned specific frequencies for different uses and imposed penalties for interference. Small changes, but they mattered. The bigger changes took longer. In November of 1913, representatives from 13 countries gathered in London for the International Conference on the Safety of Life at Sea. They spent months hammering out a new set of rules, the International Convention for Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, people called it. The convention covered everything: lifeboats, bulkheads, fire safety, navigation, emergency drills, wireless equipment. It was the most comprehensive overhaul of maritime safety in history. The key provision was simple: every ship had to carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard. No more relying on watertight compartments to keep people safe. No more assuming that help would arrive before the ship went down. If the worst happened, everyone needed a seat. SOLAS was supposed to go into effect in 1915. Then World War I broke out, and suddenly the world had bigger problems than peacetime shipping regulations. The convention was shelved. Ships kept sailing under the old rules, or no rules at all, depending on the country. It wasn't until 1929 that SOLAS was finally updated and properly enforced. 17 years after the Titanic sank, 17 years of ships sailing with inadequate lifeboats because governments couldn't get their act together. But eventually, the rules stuck. SOLAS has been updated multiple times since then. It's still the international standard for maritime safety today. Every cruise ship you've ever been on, every cargo vessel crossing the ocean, follows rules that trace back to that disaster in 1912. Another reform was the International Ice Patrol. In the immediate aftermath of the sinking, the United States Navy sent ships and cutters to patrol the area where the Titanic went down. Their job was simple: find ice, report it, warn ships so they could steer clear. But that was just a temporary measure. Something more permanent was needed. In 1914, the International Ice Patrol was established as part of the United States Coast Guard. Its mission was to monitor iceberg conditions in the North Atlantic, especially along the shipping lanes where passenger liners travelled. When dangerous ice was spotted, the patrol would broadcast warnings to all ships in the area. The patrol started with just 2 cutters. Today they use aircraft and satellites, but the mission is the same. No ship should ever be surprised by an iceberg the way the Titanic was. In over a century of operation, not a single ship heeding the Ice Patrol's warnings has been lost to ice. Not one. 1,500 people died so that number could be 0. Ship design changed too. The Titanic had what was called a double bottom. The hull was reinforced underneath to protect against grounding, but the sides of the ship were single-walled. When the iceberg scraped along the starboard side, it punched through like a knife through paper. After the disaster, ships started being built with double hulls, 2 layers of steel on the sides as well as the bottom. If something punctured the outer layer, the inner layer would still hold. The ship would take on water between the hulls but wouldn't flood the interior compartments. Watertight bulkheads were extended too. On the Titanic, the bulkheads only went up about 10 feet above the waterline. That seemed like enough. Under normal circumstances, it was, but when 5 compartments flooded and the bow dipped down, water simply poured over the top of the bulkheads into the next compartment, then the next, then the next. The ship's designer had built it to survive with any 2 compartments flooded. 5 was a death sentence. New ships had bulkheads that went all the way up to the top decks, fully watertight. Even if several compartments flooded, the water couldn't spill over into the rest of the ship. These weren't dramatic changes. You wouldn't notice them looking at a ship from the outside. But inside, in the guts of the vessel, everything was different, stronger, safer. Built by people who had learned the hard way that unsinkable was a lie. While the laws were changing and the ships were being redesigned, ordinary life continued. In Southampton, the town that had lost more people than anywhere else, widows tried to rebuild. The Titanic Relief Fund helped, charity helped, but nothing could bring back the men who'd sailed away on April 10th and never came home. Some women remarried, found new husbands who could support them and their children. Some never did. They wore their grief like a second skin, growing old in houses that felt too quiet. The children grew up. The boys who'd lost their fathers learned trades, got jobs, started families of their own. The girls who'd lost their brothers married and moved away. A new generation was born that had no memory of the disaster. To them, Titanic was just a story their grandparents told. A sad thing that happened long ago. The newspapers moved on to other stories. Wars, elections, scandals. The Titanic faded from the headlines. Years passed. Decades. In 1955, a writer named Walter Lord published a book called A Night to Remember. He'd spent years tracking down survivors, interviewing them, piecing together what had happened that night. His book brought the disaster back to life for a new generation. A movie followed in 1958. Same title. Black and white, British. It showed the sinking in a way that felt real, that felt human. Audiences cried, critics praised it. The Titanic was suddenly news again. But the ship itself remained hidden. 2.5 miles down, in the darkness of the North Atlantic, the wreck sat undisturbed. Nobody knew exactly where it was. The position that 4th Officer Boxhall had calculated that night, the one they'd broadcast in the distress calls, turned out to be wrong. Searchers who went looking found nothing but empty ocean floor. The Titanic had become a ghost, a legend, something people talked about but couldn't see, couldn't touch, couldn't prove was still there. Some people wondered if it had broken apart completely, if the pressure of the deep ocean had crushed the hull into pieces, if there was anything left to find at all. Others believed the ship was down there, intact, waiting to be discovered. They dreamed of expeditions, of submersibles that could dive deep enough to reach the wreck, of cameras that could capture images of the grand staircase, the first-class dining room, the bridge where Captain Smith had stood. The technology wasn't there yet. Not in the 50s, not in the 60s. The ocean floor at that depth was unreachable for most purposes. A few military submarines could make it, but they had other priorities, and so the Titanic waited. The survivors aged one by one. They passed away. The officers who'd loaded the lifeboats, the passengers who'd jumped into the freezing water, the crew members who'd kept the boilers running until the power finally died. Charles Lightoller died in 1952 during the Great Smog of London. His lungs, weakened by years of pipe smoking, couldn't handle the pollution. He was 78. Fourth Officer Boxhall died in 1967. His ashes were scattered at the position he'd calculated for the sinking. He went to his grave believing he'd gotten it right. Milvina Dean, who had been just 2 months old when the Titanic sank, became the last living survivor. She'd been carried off the ship in a canvas mail sack, too young to remember any of it. Her father died in the sinking. Her mother never spoke of it. Milvina lived until 2009, 97 years old. She gave interviews, attended commemorations, became a living link to a disaster that had happened before most people's grandparents were born. When she died, the last human connection to the Titanic was severed. Everyone who had been aboard that ship was gone. All that remained were documents, photographs, artifacts, and the wreck itself, still waiting in the darkness, still holding its secrets. The 20th century rolled on. Wars came and went. Technology advanced. By the 1980s, the tools finally existed to find the Titanic. Robots that could withstand crushing pressure. Cameras that could see in the eternal night of the deep ocean. Sonar that could map the sea floor in detail. Some survivors lived long enough to see this technology develop. They watched humans walk on the moon. They saw computers shrink from room-sized machines to devices that fit in your pocket, and they wondered sometimes whether anyone would ever find the ship they'd escaped from all those years ago. Edith Brown was one of these survivors. She'd been 15 when the Titanic went down. Her father had put her and her mother into a lifeboat and then stepped back. He knew there wasn't room for him. He waved goodbye as the boat was lowered. That was the last time Edith saw him. She lived until 1997, 85 years after the disaster, long enough to see the wreck discovered, long enough to watch the 1997 movie, the one with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, which brought Titanic mania to a whole new generation. Edith didn't like the movie much. Too much romance, not enough reality, but she understood why people were fascinated. The Titanic was more than a shipwreck. It was a symbol of hubris, of tragedy, of the gap between what we think we can control and what the universe actually allows. In 1985, a joint American and French expedition set out to find the wreck. They'd been searching for weeks, dragging camera sleds across miles of empty mud, finding nothing. Then, in the early hours of September 1st, a piece of debris appeared on the monitors, a boiler, one of Titanic's massive boilers, lying on the ocean floor like a discarded toy. They'd found it, the cameras dove deeper, and there, emerging from the darkness, was the bow of the Titanic, recognizable even after 73 years. The anchor, the railings, the name, still visible on the hull. The ship had broken in two, just like the survivors had said. The bow section sat upright, relatively intact, as if it might rise from the seafloor at any moment. The stern, half a mile away, was a twisted wreck, torn apart by the violence of the sinking. Robert Ballard, the oceanographer who led the American team, later described the moment they found the wreck. He'd been celebrating with his colleagues when someone pointed out that this was the spot where 1,500 people had died. The mood changed instantly. They held a brief memorial service on the deck of their research vessel. It seemed like the right thing to do. The world watched in awe as images of the wreck were broadcast around the globe. The Titanic, lost for 3/4 of a century, had been found. People saw the grand staircase, or what was left of it. They saw chandeliers and deck chairs and personal belongings scattered across the ocean floor. They saw the bow, still proud despite everything, and the stern collapsed and broken like a crushed soda can. The discovery raised new questions. Should artifacts be brought up, or should the wreck be left alone, treated as a gravesite? Who owned the Titanic now? The company that built it was long gone. The passengers' families had moved on. Did anyone have the right to disturb what lay on that ocean floor? These debates continue today. Expeditions have retrieved thousands of items from the wreck site. Dishes, jewellery, personal effects. Some say this is archaeology, others say it's grave robbing. But that's a story for later. For now, what matters is this. The disaster changed things. It forced governments to take safety seriously. It forced shipping companies to put people before profits. It forced the whole world to admit that technology has limits, that confidence isn't the same as competence, that the biggest and the best can still fail. 1,500 people died on the night of April 14th, 1912. Their deaths weren't meaningless. Their deaths made the oceans safer for everyone who came after. It's a hard kind of comfort, but it's real, and maybe that's enough. Southampton never really recovered, not completely. Walk through the old parts of town today and you'll see plaques on buildings, memorial gardens, street names that hint at the disaster. The Titanic is woven into the fabric of the place, impossible to ignore. In 1912, Southampton was a working-class town. The men who crewed the great ocean liners lived in cramped terraced houses in neighbourhoods like Northam and Chapel. They weren't rich, they weren't famous. They were stokers and stewards and trimmers, men who shovelled coal and served meals and kept the ships running. 549 of them died on the Titanic. In some streets, almost every house lost someone. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands. The women left behind had to figure out how to survive without the wages that had kept their families fed. The Titanic Relief Fund helped, but charity only goes so far. Many widows had to find work themselves, cleaning houses, taking in laundry, anything to put food on the table. Their children grew up fast, taking jobs as soon as they were old enough, contributing what they could. Some families never recovered financially. The poverty that settled over them after April 1912 lasted for generations, but there was something else too, a silence. Families didn't talk about the Titanic, not openly. The grief was too fresh, too raw. Mothers would change the subject when children asked about fathers they barely remembered. Grandparents would leave the room when the ship was mentioned on the radio. This silence lasted decades. It wasn't until the 1980s and 90s, when researchers started tracking down descendants, that many families began to share their stories. Letters came out of attics, photographs emerged from dusty albums. The children of survivors, now elderly themselves, finally spoke about what their parents had witnessed, and the stories were heartbreaking. Eva Hart was 7 years old when the Titanic sank. Her father had been hesitant about booking passage. He didn't trust the ship. Something about it made him uneasy. Her mother refused to sleep during the crossing, sitting up in her cabin each night, convinced that something terrible would happen. On the night of April 14th, Ava's mother was awake when the ship struck the iceberg. She woke her husband and daughter immediately. They made it to the boat deck while many passengers were still in their cabins, unaware of the danger. Ava's father put her and her mother into lifeboat 14. He handed Ava a blanket, told her to be a good girl. Then he stepped back and waited with the other men as the boat was lowered away. Ava watched the Titanic sink. She watched the stern rise into the air. She heard the screams of the people in the water. For the rest of her life, she couldn't stand the dark. She slept with the lights on every night. For 80 years, the trauma never faded. It just became part of who she was. Ava died in 1996, one of the last survivors with actual memories of the sinking. She'd spent her final years giving interviews, correcting misconceptions, trying to make people understand what that night had really been like. Not the romance of the movie versions, the terror, the chaos, the sound of 1,500 people dying in water cold enough to stop your heart. There were other survivors who carried similar scars. Ruth Becker was 12 when the Titanic sank. She'd been travelling with her mother and younger siblings to meet her father, a missionary in India. When the ship started to go down, Ruth helped her mother get the younger children into a lifeboat. Then she climbed in herself. But in the confusion, Ruth got separated from her family. She ended up in a different lifeboat. For hours, she had no idea if her mother and siblings had survived. She sat in the freezing darkness, surrounded by strangers, convinced she was now an orphan. They were reunited on the Carpathia. All of them had survived. It felt like a miracle. Ruth rarely spoke about the Titanic afterward. She married, had children, lived a quiet life. It wasn't until her 80s that she started opening up. She gave interviews, visited the Titanic Historical Society, even joined an expedition to view the wreck in 1990. Standing on the deck of the research vessel, looking down at the spot where the ship lay 2.5 miles below, Ruth said she felt at peace, like she'd finally closed a chapter that had been open for nearly 8 decades. She died in 1990, just weeks after that expedition. She was 90 years old. The Titanic became more than a shipwreck. It became a story we tell ourselves about human nature. We made movies about it, books, songs, plays. We built museums and exhibitions and memorial gardens. We dove to the wreck and brought up artifacts. We argued about whether the captain was negligent, whether the company was greedy, whether the disaster could have been prevented. And through all of it, we kept coming back to the same questions. What would I have done? Would I have given up my seat in a lifeboat? Would I have stayed at my post like the wireless operators? Would I have played music as the ship went down? The band has become one of the most enduring images of the disaster. 8 musicians who kept playing as passengers filed toward the lifeboats. The exact songs they performed are disputed. Some say it was hymns, some say it was ragtime. The famous story about "Nearer, my God, to Thee" might be true, or it might be legend. What we know for certain is that they didn't stop. They played until they couldn't play anymore. All 8 of them died. Their bodies, if recovered, were buried in mass graves or shipped home to families who could barely afford the funeral costs. The company that employed them sent bills for lost uniforms. The musicians' union had to fight just to get the families basic compensation. And yet, those 8 men became symbols of courage under impossible circumstances, of dignity in the face of death, of something noble in human nature that refuses to give up even when giving up is the only sensible option. That's the thing about the Titanic. It brings out both the worst and the best in people, the cowardice and the courage, the selfishness and the sacrifice. It's all there, playing out on that tilting deck in the middle of the Atlantic. The wreck itself is disappearing. Down in the darkness, 2.5 miles beneath the surface, the Titanic is being eaten. Rusticles, they call them. Strange formations of rust and bacteria that hang from the hull like icicles. They're consuming the ship, slowly turning iron into something that crumbles at a touch. Scientists estimate the wreck might collapse entirely within the next few decades. The bow section, which has held together remarkably well, is showing signs of stress. The deck is sagging. Holes are appearing in places that were solid just a few years ago. Eventually, there will be nothing left but a rust stain on the ocean floor. The grand staircase will be gone. The anchors will be gone. The hull that survivors watched slip beneath the waves will have vanished for good. Some people think this is fitting. The Titanic was never meant to be a tourist attraction. It was a grave. Let it return to the sea. Others want to preserve what they can. Expeditions have brought up thousands of artifacts over the years. A deck chair, a pair of glasses, a leather bag still holding its contents. Each item is a connection to the people who lived and died on that ship. There's a display somewhere that shows a pair of shoes, just shoes, lying on the ocean floor where a body once rested. The body is gone, consumed by the deep, but the leather shoes remain. They're facing each other, the way feet would be if someone were lying on their back. Whoever wore those shoes died right there. We don't know their name. We don't know if they were rich or poor, first class or steerage. All we know is that they went down with the ship and came to rest in that spot, and their shoes have been there ever since. It's a strange kind of memorial, accidental, unsettling, but somehow more powerful than any statue or plaque. The living survivors are all gone now. Milvina Dean, the last of them, died in 2009. She'd been just 9 weeks old when the Titanic sank. Too young to remember anything, her entire connection to the disaster was second-hand, stories passed down from her mother. Milvina spent her final years struggling financially. She had to sell her Titanic memorabilia just to pay for nursing home care. When James Cameron and other filmmakers heard about her situation, they donated money to help. It wasn't much, but it was something. She died at 97, the last thread connecting the present to that night in 1912. Now there's no one left who was there, no one who can tell us what the cold water felt like, no one who can describe the sounds of the ship breaking apart, no one who remembers the faces of the people who didn't make it. All we have are documents, photographs, artifacts, and a rusting hulk on the ocean floor, slowly fading into nothing, but the story endures. Every few years, something brings the Titanic back into the news. An anniversary, a documentary, a new expedition to the wreck site, and each time people are drawn back to this disaster that happened over a century ago. 1997 was the biggest surge. That was the year James Cameron's film came out. The one with the love story and the floating door and Celine Dion singing about hearts going on. The movie made nearly $2 billion. It won 11 Academy Awards. For months you couldn't go anywhere without hearing that song, and suddenly everyone was interested in the Titanic again. People who'd never thought twice about a century-old shipwreck were reading books, visiting museums, booking tours to Halifax where many of the victims are buried. The Titanic Historical Society saw its membership spike. Auction houses reported record prices for artifacts. The surviving survivors were tracked down by media from around the world. Eleanor Schumann, who'd been 18 months old during the sinking, gave interviews to newspapers and television programs. So did Michel Navratil, who'd been 3 years old, kidnapped by his father, and travelling under an assumed name. So did Beatrice Sandstrom, who remembered her mother crying in the lifeboat as they pulled away from the ship. Most of them were ambivalent about the film. They appreciated that it brought attention to the disaster. They were less thrilled about the romance that overshadowed the history. Some of them wished Cameron had spent more time on the real people, the actual passengers whose stories were just as dramatic as anything a screenwriter could invent. But they also understood something important. The movie introduced a new generation to the Titanic. Kids who'd been born 70 years after the sinking were now asking their grandparents about it. Libraries saw an uptick in research requests. Schools incorporated the disaster into their history curricula. The Titanic was no longer fading from memory. It was permanent, embedded in the culture in a way that wouldn't fade. In Southampton, the memorials multiplied. There's a museum now, dedicated to the Titanic and the town's connection to it. Exhibits walk you through the ship's construction, the voyage, the sinking, the aftermath. There are interactive displays where you can look up passengers and crew, find out if they survived, learn what happened to them afterward. There's a memorial in East Park, a bronze engineer standing tall, honouring the 35 engineers who stayed at their posts, keeping the lights on and the pumps running until the very end. Not one of them survived. There's another memorial for the musicians, and another for the postal workers, and plaques scattered throughout the city, marking the homes of crew members who sailed away and never came back. The city carries the disaster in its bones. You can walk streets where entire rows of houses were emptied by the sinking. You can visit pubs where crew members drank their last pints before boarding the ship. You can stand on the dock where passengers embarked, not knowing they were taking their final steps. Southampton can't afford to forget. The disaster shaped the city's identity. It made them who they are, and maybe that's true for all of us, in a smaller way. Why does it still matter? Maybe because it reminds us that progress has limits, that confidence isn't the same as competence, that the biggest and best and most modern things can still fail in spectacular ways. Maybe because the passengers were so varied. Millionaires and immigrants, first class and steerage, people heading to new lives in America and people returning home from vacations in Europe, all of them equal when the ship went down. Maybe because the story has heroes and villains, cowards and saints. Because it gives us a canvas to project our own fears and hopes onto. Or maybe it's simpler than that. Maybe we remember the Titanic because 1,500 people died and they deserved to be remembered, not as statistics, not as lessons, as people who were alive and then weren't, who had families and dreams and plans for the future. Their deaths meant something. They have to mean something. The Titanic Relief Fund operated until 1959. For nearly half a century, it provided assistance to widows, orphans and injured survivors. When it finally closed, many of the children it had helped were grandparents themselves. They'd built lives on the foundation of charity given by strangers after the worst night of their lives. Some of them went back to sea, became sailors like their fathers had been, faced the Atlantic that had taken so much from them and refused to be afraid. There's something almost defiant about that, a refusal to let the tragedy define them entirely. Others stayed as far from the ocean as they could, moved inland, chose careers that kept their feet on solid ground. You couldn't blame them. After what they'd seen, after what they'd lost, why would they ever trust the sea again? And so we keep telling the story, over and over, generation after generation, making sure the Titanic is never forgotten. The night is getting late. The story is almost over, but there's still a little more to tell. So here we are, at the end. You've been lying there this whole time, listening to a story about a ship that sank over 100 years ago, about the people who survived, the people who didn't, the lawsuits and inquiries and reforms, the grief that lasted generations. It's a lot to take in. But here's the thing. You're warm right now, safe. The sheets around you are soft. The pillow under your head is just the right amount of squishy. Nobody's going to wake you up at 2 in the morning and tell you to get into a lifeboat. That's not nothing. That's actually kind of everything. The passengers on the Titanic didn't know what was coming. They went to bed on April 14th thinking they'd wake up the next morning and have breakfast and maybe take a walk on the deck. They had plans, dinner reservations, letters to write, people waiting for them in New York. And then the iceberg changed everything. We don't get warnings either most of the time. Life just happens. The good stuff and the bad stuff all tangled up together. But tonight, right now, in this moment, you're okay. Your heart is beating. Your lungs are working. The world outside might be chaotic, but in here, in your little cocoon of blankets and darkness, everything is still. That stillness is a gift. Don't take it for granted. The survivors of the Titanic understood this better than most. They'd seen how quickly everything could disappear. A ship that seemed indestructible, gone in less than 3 hours. Fortunes wiped out. Families shattered. Lives ended in water so cold it stopped your heart before you could even try to swim. After that, how could you ever feel completely safe again? Some of them didn't. They spent the rest of their lives waiting for the next disaster, jumping at loud noises, refusing to travel by ship ever again. The trauma rewired their brains, made them see danger everywhere. But others found a different path. They decided that since life was fragile, they might as well live it fully. They took risks, tried new things, said yes to opportunities they might have turned down before. The Titanic had taught them that tomorrow wasn't guaranteed, so you'd better make the most of today. Both responses make sense. There's no right way to survive. Charles Lightoller, the officer who went back to sea and ended up at Dunkirk, seems like he chose the second path. He'd already nearly died once. What was the point of being afraid? He sailed his little yacht across the channel at 66 years old into the middle of a war because there were people who needed saving. The Titanic had shown him what drowning men look like. He wasn't going to leave anyone behind if he could help it. Bruce Ismay chose the first path. After the disaster, he retreated, hid from the world, let the guilt and the shame consume him until there was nothing left but a hollow shell. His wife tried to protect him, banning any mention of the ship, but you can't outrun your own memories. They follow you everywhere. Most survivors fell somewhere in between. They carried the scars, but they kept going. Got married, had kids, worked jobs, built lives. The Titanic was part of their story, but it wasn't the whole story. Think about what that took to wake up every morning knowing what you'd survived, to eat breakfast and go to work and make small talk with neighbours, all while carrying the weight of that night inside you, to watch your children grow up and wonder if they could sense the sadness you tried so hard to hide. Some survivors talked about it constantly. They gave interviews, wrote memoirs, spoke at commemorations. They made the Titanic their identity, turning trauma into purpose. There's something brave about that, refusing to let the worst night of your life define you in silence. Others never said a word. They locked the memories away in a room they never entered. Their children grew up not knowing. Their grandchildren only found out after they died, going through papers in attics and finding newspaper clippings, letters, a ticket stub from a voyage they never knew their grandmother had taken. Both approaches were survival strategies. Both made sense. There's no instruction manual for living with something like that, and now they're all gone. Every last one of them. The final survivor, Milvina Dean, died in 2009. She was 97 years old. She'd been a baby during the sinking, too young to remember any of it, but she carried the weight of it anyway. Her father had died that night. Her family had been torn apart before she was old enough to know what family meant. When Milvina died, something shifted. The Titanic moved from living memory into pure history. There's nobody left who can tell you what it was like to stand on that deck, to feel the ship listing beneath your feet, to hear the band playing as the lifeboats pulled away. All we have now are the stories they left behind. And maybe that's enough. Stories are powerful things. They let us feel what other people felt. Even across centuries, they let us stand on the deck of a sinking ship without getting our feet wet. They let us understand in some small way what it means to face the end of everything you thought you knew. The Titanic story has been told so many times now. Movies and books and documentaries and podcasts. Every angle has been examined. Every theory has been debated. We know more about those 3 days in April 1912 than some people know about their own families. And still, the story holds us. Maybe because it's about more than a shipwreck. It's about who we are when everything goes wrong. It's about the choices we make under pressure. It's about the lies we tell ourselves when we think we're invincible. The people who built the Titanic thought they'd conquered the ocean. They thought technology had finally won. And for a few days, it seemed like they were right. The ship was beautiful, massive, filled with wonders that passengers had never seen before. Then the ocean reminded them who was really in charge. We still make that mistake, you know. We build things and think they'll last forever. We make plans and assume they'll work out. We look at the future and see smooth sailing even when the icebergs are already floating toward us. The Titanic is a reminder to be humble, to respect the forces we can't control, to never assume that just because something is big and new and expensive, it's also safe. We live in a world full of unsinkable ships, technology we trust without question, systems we assume will always work, and most of the time they do. Most of the time we get away with our confidence. But every once in a while, an iceberg appears out of the darkness. A thing we didn't expect, a flaw we didn't notice, and suddenly all our assumptions come crashing down. The Titanic reminds us to pay attention, to not get too comfortable, to remember that the universe doesn't care about our schedules or our plans or how much money we spent on something, but it's also a reminder of something else, something warmer. When the ship was sinking, people helped each other. Strangers gave up their seats in lifeboats. Musicians played to keep passengers calm. Wireless operators stayed at their posts until the water rose around their ankles. Engineers kept the lights on so people could find their way to the deck. Not everyone was heroic. There was panic and selfishness and cowardice too. But there was also grace, real human grace in the face of something terrible. That's worth remembering. The world after the Titanic was different from the world before. Ships carried enough lifeboats for everyone. Wireless operators worked around the clock. Ice patrols warned ships of danger ahead. Thousands of lives were saved by changes that came directly from that disaster. The people who died on April 15th, 1912 didn't die for nothing. Their deaths forced the world to do better, to be safer, to take the ocean seriously. That doesn't make the tragedy less tragic, but it gives it meaning. It turns senseless loss into something that actually mattered. 1,500 people. Think about that number for a second. 1,500 lives, each one as real and complicated as your own. They had parents and children and friends. They had favourite foods and private jokes and recurring dreams. They had fears they couldn't explain and hopes they barely dared to voice. All of them gone in one night. And yet, here we are, 100 years later, still talking about them, still remembering their names, still trying to understand what they went through. In a strange way, that's a kind of immortality. Most of us won't be remembered for 100 years. Most of us will fade from memory a generation or two after we're gone, but the people on the Titanic, they've become permanent. They're part of history now, part of a story that will be told as long as humans tell stories. Is that a comfort? I don't know. Maybe it depends on who you ask, but I think it matters. I think remembering matters. I think taking the time to learn about people who lived and died before us is one of the most human things we can do. So thank you for listening. Thank you for caring about a disaster that happened before your grandparents were born. Thank you for lying there in the dark, letting this story wash over you, feeling something for strangers who've been gone for over a century. That connection across time is precious. It's what makes us human. The ability to care about people we never met, to mourn losses that aren't our own, to learn from mistakes we didn't make. The passengers on the Titanic would have understood. They came from different countries, spoke different languages, lived in different worlds. But in those final hours, none of that mattered. They were all just people facing the same cold water, the same terrifying night. And here you are, over 100 years later, lying in your bed, thinking about them, wondering what you would have done, feeling grateful that you'll never have to find out. The Titanic survivors would have appreciated that. They wanted people to remember. They didn't want the ship to fade into footnotes and statistics. They wanted the world to understand what happened that night, and to make sure it never happened again. We've kept that promise mostly. Ships are safer now. The ocean is still dangerous, but we've learned to respect it. The lessons of the Titanic are built into every cruise liner, every cargo vessel, every ferry crossing rough water. The dead didn't die in vain. Their legacy is written in maritime law and ship design and international cooperation. Every time a ship sails safely across the Atlantic, the Titanic is part of that journey. Invisible, but there. And down in the darkness, 2.5 miles below the surface, the wreck keeps its vigil, crumbling slowly into rust, returning to the ocean that claimed it. The grand staircase is gone now. The deck is sagging. The bow that Jack and Rose stood on in the movie is collapsing under its own weight. Scientists say the bacteria eating the hull will finish their work within the next few decades. The iron that took thousands of workers years to shape will dissolve into the sea. The ship that was supposed to last forever will be gone. There's something almost poetic about that. The Titanic returning to the elements it was made from. Iron becoming rust, becoming nothing. The ocean reclaiming what was always hers. Some people want to raise the ship, bring it back to the surface, put it in a museum where everyone can see it, but that's probably impossible now. The hull is too fragile. It would fall apart before it ever reached the light, so the wreck will stay where it is. A memorial on the ocean floor, visited by submersibles and cameras and the occasional deep-sea creature that doesn't know or care what it's swimming through. Someday there won't be anything left, just a debris field on the ocean floor, shoes and bottles and bits of metal scattered across the mud. The Titanic will be truly gone, but the story will remain. Stories don't rust, they don't collapse. They get passed from person to person, generation to generation, changing a little each time, but never disappearing entirely. 100 years from now, someone will still be telling the story of the Titanic. Maybe they'll get some details wrong. Maybe they'll add things that didn't really happen, but the core of it, the truth of it, will survive. A ship that thought it couldn't sink, an iceberg in the darkness, 1,500 souls lost to the cold Atlantic, and the survivors, the ones who lived with it for the rest of their lives, who woke up sweating from dreams of drowning, who flinched at the sound of rushing water, who carried their dead with them every single day until they finally joined them. Their pain was real, their courage was real, their stories deserve to be told. So here's to them, to the ones who made it and the ones who didn't, to the officers and the crew and the passengers, to the band that kept playing and the wireless operators who kept sending, to the children who grew up without fathers and the widows who never remarried, to everyone whose life was touched by that terrible, beautiful, unforgettable ship. They're at peace now. All of them, the survivors and the lost, the famous and the forgotten, they've found the rest that was denied them on that cold April night. And maybe you can find some rest too. Your bed is warm, the room is quiet, the Titanic is far away, separated from you by oceans and decades and the comforting distance of history. Let your eyes close, let your breathing slow, let the story settle into your mind like sediment drifting to the ocean floor. The Titanic sailed, the Titanic sank, the world changed, the people are gone, but tonight you're here, you're safe, and that's all that matters. Sleep well.